Hello crafty monkeys. Right, what am I going to get you to make with one of your quilt blocks? I'm going to get you to make a wrap to either hold something like makeup brushes, pens, pencils, anything like that. So here's the wrap. Let me just undo it. So you'll see I've used one of the disappearing 9-patch blocks for the actual design on the outside of the wrap. But on the inside, there we are. I've created this all these pockets down here, which you can put things like your makeup brushes, even like crochet hooks, art brushes. It can become anything. And depending on what colorways and what the design, like the pattern on the inside and the outside is, might tell you who it's for. It might be for yourself, or it could be a really good present for somebody. Skills wise, what am I going to get you to do? Well, we're gonna layer up. So we've got a lining, we've got a pocket, but we've got some bumf in there as well, and I've used a synthetic bumf. We're going to also finish off with some nice binding, so you're going to do some mitered edges on the binding, and you're going to use a sewing machine to put them in, but also you can use some hand stitching to do it also, and also inserting the ribbon here to actually then that becomes the tie. So it's for really any ability. It's really great for actually someone that's really sort of starting out with just starting to do blocks, some quilting, some binding, and just a bit of control over the sewing machine and just getting yourself to do a bit of stitching on the machine with a little bit of control. So watch this and follow the instructions, and hopefully you're going to come out with something as useful as this wrap to put all your bits and pieces in, or as a really nice gift to give to somebody. Okay, to make the wrap, first of all you need to start off with your quilt block. I've done a disappearing 9-patch, and my original 9 patches or squares were 5 inches by 5 inches. It's actually given me a total of 13 by 13 inches by square. The next thing you need is to think about the lining. So I'm going to pick up this colour for my lining, and so I'm going to cut exactly the same square by laying the quilt block over the fabric and cutting exactly the same square again. And that's going to be my lining. Think about the pocket at the bottom of the wrap. So I'm going to do a block in black. So I'm going to, again, that's going to fit down here somewhere. So I'm going to put, you're going to need a whole piece, the same size again, in a block of black, or whatever colour you want to use. Finally, for the fabric layers or the sandwiches, you're going to have a piece of bumf. Again, measuring the 13 by 13. This one's a synthetic bumf. It's actually quite nice because it doesn't shrink. So I tend to use it quite a lot. It's very reasonably priced. And so it's a good opportunity for this project to have a little play with it to see how you get on with that. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some bias tape or some bias binding to go and just do the finishing around the outside of the wrap. So again, you're going to need more than just the perimeter. So if you think my perimeter is four lots of 13, that's going to be, oh, got the maths going here. So that's going to be a 52-inch parameter. So I would have more than 52. I'd add on another couple of inches so that you've got an overlap when you put all the bias tape around the outside. So do be a bit generous with your tape. The other thing you might need as well, or you will need, is some ribbon. So again, I'd say about 1 metre of ribbon, and this ribbon could be any type. This is like an organza ribbon that I had in my stash. It's a pink, so it matches with what I'm making, and that's about 1/2 inch wide, and again probably about 1 metre should be enough to do the project. So next is equipment. What equipment do you need? So you need something to cut out with. So you need some scissors. You might want to use a rotary blade. You can use some little snips for tidying up your work as you go along. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need something to measure and to draw against. So for measuring, I always have my tape measure handy. So a tape measure with either inches or centimetres, however you prefer to work. And then something that you can square up your work with and draw straight lines. So here I've got my grader square and a ruler, but you might have a quilter square or something like that you can actually draw straight lines. I'm going to draw my straight lines on my black with some chalk because that will show up. But you could use a fabric pen. You might be able to use a chalk pencil, something like this. Whatever you can draw the lines where you're going to be stitching. The other thing you'll need is you'll need some pins, plenty of pins just to hold all your work together, some needles for when you need to do some hand finishing, and some thread. So thread to match your work. You might do a couple of colours of thread. It's entirely down to you. The other equipment you'll need is your sewing machine, just a straight stitch machine, though if you want to you can do this whole project by hand. It just takes a little bit longer, but it's entirely down to you how you want to work. And the other thing I've got on is my iron and my ironing board, so to press work in between as you're going along. So first to do is make the pocket at the bottom of the wrap. Now if I turn this over, what I want you to do is I want you to just mark off 1 inch along the bottom, any side of the square piece of fabric, and mark with a piece of chalk or something 1 inch, and then I want you to just cut off that inch. We don't need that. And put that to one side, you don't need that. Then fold your piece of fabric in half and press it. So you've pressed that down, so just press that. Now that is now an oblong there, and that is actually going to sit on the bottom of your lining. So then get your lining and then line up where your pocket bag is going to be, and line that up along the bottom. It will become apparent why we've not actually just turned it into half, but for the moment I just want you to line it up like that. Take 1 inch off the bottom, fold it in half, and then line it up on the bottom. Next thing to do is actually then just to secure it with a few pins, so it's not all wobbling around and moving about while you're working on it. So we're just going to put a few pins. First of all, I put some pins in the corner like that. So just like that. So we've got that all in place. Next thing is to think about is what actually is going into these pockets. You might not know, because it might be a gift and it might be however anyone wants to use it, but you can do a selection of pocket sizes and things like that. So for instance, if it's going to be makeup brushes, you can lay your makeup brush out. It might be artist brushes, so it could be some artist brushes. You might even want to be using it as a wrap for all your crochet needles, so you might want to put a crochet needle on, and you might even want a little area where your scissors go in as well. So think about that. So I'm just going to position these so that they just poke out at the top, like so, like that. And then with your chalk, what you can do is just draw with your chalk around the perimeter, so all the way down to the bottom there. But this one I'm going to draw along there so they stop there. That one along there, that one a little bit shorter there, that one all the way down there, that line to there, and 2 lines here. Okay, so take whatever I'm going to be putting in my pocket, take that away. Now what I want you to do now is then you're going to go back with either your ruler or your grader square, and you're really going to draw these lines in nice and straight. So I'm going to go away and do that, and I'll be back. Okay, right, so once you've straightened all your lines out like I have here, then you're going to just sew down these little pockets, remembering that you've got the nice folded edge up here and all the raw edges at the bottom of your work. So you start upside down, so thinking that this is the end. So start at the raw edge. I'm going to use white thread, but you could use, if you're using black, you know, on here because it's black, or if it's pink, it's pink. But I'm going to use white because then you can see where I'm stitching. So I'm going to just stitch up to the end, and as I get to the end, I'm just going to go to the end, and then I'm going to back stitch a couple of back stitches there, and then come forward again and back stitch again. I'm doing that because that's going to be a stress point there. So the more I go forward, back, then that will be nice and secure then. Then you finish that one with your little snips, cut your threads, and you're away. If you're going to do one which is, say, it's not from the bottom of the fabric, and you're going to come maybe halfway up like here, what you can do here is you can start in a corner. So put your needle in a corner, come round, leave your needle in, lift your foot up and turn, and then come up to the end that way, and then one backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. Now I'm going to leave you a way to just go and sew all those little channels up. I'm going to do the same. Just remembering when you get to the top that you're going to do forwards, back, and then that should be all right. Don't worry about the loose sides and the bottoms at the moment. That's all going to be encased with some bias tape later on. There we are. So all our little sections are now all stitched out, making sure that we've trimmed all loose threads and these are all nice and secure and they're not going to be coming away. So now we're ready to start layering up all the layers, starting with, if I put this to one side, move that there, we're going to just start with the quilt block outer of the wrap. So turn that so the wrong side is facing you forwards. Think about actually what you want to have at the bottom of your wrap and what you want to have on the top. So that's where you might want to think about the position and which way you want your quilt sample to be. So leave that there. Next you're going to put your piece of bumf over the top. That's that, and square that all up, making sure that's all nice and layered, all nice on top. And then you're going to then layer, the next layer becomes the wrap inside. Again, just check that you're quite happy with what's going to be at the bottom of your wrap, because that is where your pockets are going to be, in that end there. Now, we just don't worry if it's there's a slight overlap or a sort of discrepancy in the layers. What's happened is, though it all started off as the same sizes, as you've been stitching into this, the actual piece has actually started to fractionally become smaller the more you stitch into it. But we can square all this up and neaten this up in a minute. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to just secure the layers with some pins in the corner to start with. We've just secured them. We're just going to put one lot in the middle there, just there, and there. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to now quilt through the layers to actually hold all these in together before we put our binding round. So we're going to do what's called, we're going to stitch in the ditch, and we're actually going to stitch in this ditch, which is really just the seam. We're going to stitch all the way through there, so it goes through from the front to the back, and that's why the pockets were slightly lower, because we don't want to be stitching closed all these pockets. So the stitching line would be just a little bit above there, and then we're going to take the line from there and we're going to stitch upwards. We're not going to stitch into the pockets at the bottom, but we're just going to stitch on the top, and that will just stop it from all shifting around and just hold it so that when we've got our wrap, that this doesn't all sort of start to bag out, that it all sort of keeps itself together. So I'm going to move over to the machine and just going to machine those bits. So now I'm ready to actually start stitching in my ditch. So I'm going to be following this seam line and I'm going to be stitching through all the layers to actually secure them all. Now for my purpose, I'm going to have a white top thread and a black bottom thread. As long as you keep the threads at the same quality and possibly the same make, you're not going to have any problem using two different threads on the top and the bottom. But think about what colour is going to come out through the bottom and what one's going to be on the top for your quilting. So I'm going to lift up my foot and I'm going to just position my needle in through that seam, and I'm going to just carefully and slowly, keeping the fabric secure both on the top and the bottom, and I'm just going to stitch through that ditch, following that line, following the line of where the seam line is between all those pieces that have been put together. This is a really simple way of just starting. If you haven't done quilting before, you might just want to practice doing this for doing some quilting. If you don't want to use pins to hold it together, you can quite happily just tack all your work together with some large tacking stitches around the perimeter of the work and going through the work just to hold it all together. But for me, because I'm being a bit lazy really, I'm just using pins on this occasion. Okay, got to the bottom. There we are. So just take that away. Let me just cut my thread. There you go. So not too bad. You can see a little bit of the stitching. The idea is really to have the stitching going right through on the back. There's no tucks or creases, so that I'm quite happy with the way the back is. But can you see it's just above these pocket lines? If we hadn't reduced the size of this piece, which is all the pockets, you would have been stitching that close. Now the next one we're going to do is we're going to actually stitch up through this line here, and that's just to hold it all in position. So I'm just going to position my fabric, and we're going to do exactly the same thing again, making sure that the fabric's all lying nice and flat, and then we're just going to stitch through the ditch, and we're just going to, and that just secures all those layers together. So if I was using a pink, you wouldn't see the stitches so much, but for this occasion, as I said, I'm just, so that you can see where I'm going, I'm just using white thread. Okay, and then when you get to the finish there, you're just going to backstitch 2 back stitches and then cut your threads. Now what I don't want you to do is you're not going to come down through here, because if you came down through here you'd start stitching your pockets at the other side. So basically you're just working on the top of your wrap. So now I've come back and I'm going to start trimming it up. I've given it a press, and I'm going to use my blade and my rotary blade and my grader square or my quilting square to actually just square the whole piece up. So we're just going to go back and we're just going to get rid of all those mismatched layers at the sides, making sure that it's all trimmed up all the way through. So start from the front, see if there's anything overlapping, and then square those back up. Turn over, check the other side, it's all nice and looks quite square. I'm just going to do this little bottom piece here, get that done. There we are. Okay, there we are, all neat and tidy. And then the next thing to do is I just want you to just tack round the outside. Can be in some white thread, and that's just to hold all the edges together while we then put the bias binding tape around. So I'm going to leave you to go and do that. Right, so now we're going to just recap on where we've got to so far. So we've put our pocket bags on the bottom and we've stitched them down. We've then layered up all the layers that we've got for our wrap, and then we've quilted through the center through here, and then we've quilted through the center just at the top, but we didn't quilt below because we didn't want to quilt into our pockets here. We've then neatened up the outside, so we've trimmed away any excess or bits of overlap that we didn't want. We've checked both sides, and then I've just done a running stitch, tacking stitch all the way round, just about 1/2 inch in. So next thing, we're going to turn it over, and we're going to cut ourselves a nice piece of ribbon. So I'm using this crystal ganza in a pink, which is going to be really nice and pretty, but you might have some satin ribbon or you might have some tape. It's entirely down to you what you want to use. There's about 1 meter here, so I'd say about 1.5 yards. Now I would divide this into 3. So think of it into 3, and then just take 2/3, so you've got a shorter piece and a longer piece. It doesn't have to be exact, and that's then hold the piece where it holds it where it's actually folded over, and that's going to be inserted into the side and trapped once we put the binding down. Now that is the ribbon that actually ties the whole wrap together, and you don't need 2 equal long pieces because one bit's going to wrap round, and then you're going to have 2 pieces then that you can tie into a nice bow to finish with. Now I'm not going to insert the ribbon dead in the center, but you could if you wanted to. I'm going to bring it down here a little bit. You'll see later why I've brought it down a little bit here, just so it looks a bit more balanced. So I'm just going to pop it in there, and I'm just going to hold that in place with a couple of pins, or you could put a couple of tack stitches in there as well. Alright, so, and to stop, little sort of tip I would say to stop it getting caught in while you're putting the binding down, because there's nothing worse than actually binding your wrap and then suddenly the ribbon has got all caught up into your binding. It's just sort of almost like roll it up into a neat little sort of piece like that, and then just hold it in the center with a couple of pins, just so it doesn't wander off and get trapped in any of the corners while you're sewing. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins there, and that'll just hold it all in place there, so that when I'm sewing around, that doesn't wander off into one of the seams and get caught while I'm doing the binding. All right, let's move over to the sewing machine and let's start putting the binding around the outside. So we're at the machine and we're going to put our binding on. Now I'm going to start my binding from the centre bottom of the wrap. So think where the pocket is, and I'm going to look for that centre line there, and I'm going to actually stitch with my machine the binding from the front, and then we're going to pull it round to the back and we're going to hand stitch it through on the back. But we're going to do a machine applied binding with mitered corners for the front. So think about which direction you want to go with your machining. So I'm going to go, let's have a look, we're going to go this way. So the machining is going to come down towards this way, away from me. We're going to start off with just turning over the binding before we actually start to stitch it. And we're going to stitch 1/4 inch in. Now, I've marked in each corner with a pin 1/4 inch in. So I've marked in from the edge here 1/4 inch, put a pin, 1/4 inch, and I've put a pin. Because what we're going to do is we're going to use that to miter the corner. So I'm going to just take this pin here. I'm going to show you what I did. Get my tape measure. And I'm going to measure, in fact, with just 1/4 inch in, and I'm just going to put a pin. In fact, I'm going to put a pin coming from the outside in because it won't get caught up in my hand when it's going through. So measure 1/4 inch and put a pin in, and that's where we're going to stop. So we're going to line up the binding, and we're just going to stitch 1/4 inch in, remembering that we've turned it over maybe like 1/2 inch there in the center. That will give us a nice neat finish when we turn it through to the other side. So we're just going to start forward through a few stitches and go back a few stitches. Again, I'm using the white so you can see where I'm going, and I'm just stitching. You don't have to rush at this. I'm just going to stitch 1/4 inch in. When I get to the pin, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to just back stitch a couple of back stitches, and then going to come away. I'm going to lift my foot, and I'm going to just come away here and just trim that back, the thread around there. Then we're going to turn the piece of work, and then you're going to then turn your binding down, up, that way, and then down that way. Like that. So I'm going to do that again so you can see it. Even I have to think about what I'm doing there. So once you've got the knack of it, it will all come. So you've stitched up to there, and that's going to stop there. Then you've got to stitch, then you've got to fold your binding up, so where it stops there. So think about it has a straight line. So fold your binding up away from you that way. Keep your finger in there, and then fold it down again. If I hold that there, can you see I've got a nice square edge there? And then we start stitching again 1/4 inch in from the top. It might be a good idea to actually take that pin out of the way, because that's just going to break our needle. So we can take the pin out, and then we're going to then start stitching again. So come in, stitch forward, stitch back, and then just carry on 1/4 inch down. And I'm going to stop there because I'm going to show you what we're doing. And take these threads away. So we stitched across here, we stopped, and then we folded it up and across to get this nice little flappy piece here. And then when we look, when we're going to turn it over, we've got a lovely mitered edge corner to our, or a binding to our quilt edge there. And then on the other side we can make that all neat and tidy, because we can fold that in with our fingers, and then we can then slip stitch that, but that'll come later. So I'm going to carry on all the way round. I'm going to carry on doing my mitered corners all the way round, and then I'll show you where we get to when we turn it over to the other side. So we're just going to come to our last mitered corner, which I'm just going to show you again. So I come all the way round, I'm going to come all the way down. I put a pin in place 1/4 of an inch away from my finishing spot here, so it's 1/4 of an inch there. That's where I'm going to stop. There we are, nearly there, and stop, 2 back stitches, and then come off completely. So lift my needle, come away, and just trim my threads there, because then I need to reposition the binding. So now I'm going to turn it 1/4. I take the pin out, don't need the pin in there anymore. We're going to push, the binding is going to go up, so following the line up that way, and I'm going to put my finger there, and then we're going to then pull the binding down like that, if you can see that. So the binding is now square again, so we've gone up, creating a little sort of triangle here. Put your finger on the triangle and then bring the binding back down over your finger, and then put your finger there to press it all in place, and you should have a nice neat little square corner then. And then you start sewing again, and then you bring your machine in and you start machining in 1/4 of an inch in, forward, back, and then machine down. Now we're getting to where we started, near to where we started, so we've got I'll come down a little bit more. So this is where we've started here, with the piece that we started off with a turnover. So if we come and we run our binding over the top of that and just come in and just go over, so there's the join. We're just going to come over another 1/2 inch and then back stitch, and then bring the needle up and then trim our threads. And actually we're going to trim the binding now at this point, so we're going to just cut it to where we've stopped. So you will see that when this folds over and we make a neat finish of that, that's got a really neat finish there on the edge. So then we can fold them both over, and then they can fold over again when we slip stitch the other side. I'm going to take this away and I'm going to press it. I'm going to press in all my corners, and I'm going to press it over to the other side, so we've got nice neat corners on the other side as well. I think what I will do is actually I'm going to do a little running tack stitch all the way around to hold it down in place, because then that'll make my life easier for when I'm slip stitching. And then I'll show you how to slip stitch, and I'll do it in white so that you can see the little technique for the slip stitches. But obviously you would do a colour that was was the same colour as the binding itself. So now we're ready to start doing the slip stitching. What I have done is I've taken out the original tacking stitches, which were around the edge of the work, so they've come out, and now I've pressed my binding down, and I've pressed it both sides, and I've just run a little tacking stitch just really to hold it in place. As you get more practice, you won't need this tacking stitch in place, you can just do it automatically. So I'm just going to turn it over. So what we're going to do is we've moved the bias binding from one side, we've pulled it over to the other and pressed it, and it's all in position, and we've got to then slip stitch this all just beautifully in place. You can use a sewing machine if you wanted to just run a little stitch along there, but I think you get a really nice finish if you just finish it off by hand. Right, for this, just to show you, I'm going to use white thread, but obviously I am going to finish this off with black thread. So what you need to do, you need to start off from one side, not necessarily a corner, but somewhere in at this point. Anchor your thread underneath the bias binding. So I'm not someone that puts knots into threads, it's a single thread, smallish needle. Just anchor your thread there underneath the binding, then move the binding over the top. So what you want to do is you want to actually catch the binding, so you're going to come through the binding, and then you're going to bring the needle over the top, catch through the quilt, but not right through to the other side, just the quilt lining, and then come up through, back through the bias binding. So you've just caught it down, and you'll see the tiny little stitches, and I'm just moving literally probably about 1/8 of an inch along just to catch. And as you get more practice, you'll be able to make those little catch on the top, like on the little stitch on the bias binding, start to completely disappear inside. So I'm going through, I'm bringing the needle down behind, catching the quilt and the the bump in the middle, and probably I'm catching the lining on top, so I'm just catching that and I'm just coming through and then securing it and then going through again, coming through. But my stitches aren't coming through to the other side, so I'm literally not going through to the binding to the other side. I'm just catching a layer or a couple of layers as I go through. So the needle goes down through, up through the binding, catch the binding, come up, secure, and then go through. And as you imagine, I'm going to do this in black, but just for white for you to see. There you go, all stitched. Stitched and pressed, tidied up. Any loose little threads or anything that was needed tidying up, I've tidied up. And then I've pressed it. I've also pressed a crease in, so I can actually have that come down like that. On the back, I've checked that, that I haven't caught my ribbon in, so my ribbon is nicely secured in. It's all ready to really load up with bits and pieces. So it can have anything in there, really. It can have makeup brushes in there, but you might want to put ordinary like artist brushes in there. You might want to put some pencils and pens, but you could also make one which took a load of crochet hooks and things like that. So there's plenty of different things that you can use it for. Fold the top down and then you would roll up from one side like so. There we go. And then with the longer piece of ribbon, I would go round, let's just get that, with the longer piece of ribbon, go round twice, 1, 2, actually 3 times, and then you've got the ribbon there to tie into a nice bow just to hold it all together. I think it'd make a nice gift, and if anything, it's quite a useful way of using up all your samples and your ideas for quilt blocks. Enjoy.